Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I think it would be an exaggeration to use the legend title. I'd say I'm a leader of a big organization, but it's good to be here as part of this series. Let me start by saying I was intrigued when I got this invitation, because as I learned about Carey Business School, I understood that you've really reimagined what an MBA could be, and so you should be congratulated for forging a new path forward. I'm a big believer in, there's a quote from Robert Kennedy almost 45 years ago that says, "The future does not belong to those who are content with today, timid and fearful in the face of bold projects and new ideas. Rather, it will belong to those who can blend vision, reason, and courage in personal commitment." And so I'm a big believer that any leader or future leader sitting out there should be looking around corners, shouldn't let fear drive their decision making, should take on some big challenges while mitigating risk, and should really try to make a positive difference and know where they're driving to. Now, as she mentioned, I came, I'm the Internal Revenue Service Commissioner today, but I've had the privilege of having a career that spanned both the private and public sector. So I started out as a consultant. I was then one of the handful of people who helped launch Teach for America back in its very entrepreneurial days. I then have launched a business, been a private equity investor, run a lot of infrastructure and regulated capital markets, and now I'm IRS commissioner. And I'm often asked, what's it like leading the IRS? And that's understandable, because I always say we've got a ubiquitous brand. Most Americans, they have in their mind what the IRS is, and most of the views are shaped by popular culture, and kind of think of this agency, and indeed a lot of government agencies, but the IRS in particular, as a mysterious, monolithic bureaucracy. And I think a lot of people think of us as an enforcement agency. Now, not to let the facts spoil some of the mythology, but in reality, the IRS is a very different place. As commissioner, I'm head of a 100,000-person organization. It's really a financial services institution that processes about $2.5 trillion every year for over 200 million customers. And I'd posit to you, and think about your own experience, most people's interaction with us is they get their taxes prepared, they electronically file, and they get a refund. Most people's experience is not the experience of the IRS agent showing up at your door, combing through your records. The unique thing, though, about us as a financial service institution, moving money and interacting with people, is that we touch every adult American every year, and tens of millions of nonprofit organizations, and every business every year, at least those that are fortunate enough to have a little profit. Hopefully, all of you coming out of Carey Business School will be in that category, the tax-paying category. And that's why it's so important for us to calibrate our interactions with the American people, to be very focused on service, and to have a compliance operation that finds people who are trying to evade taxes, but really is an organization that has a lot of equilibrium and mostly is trying to serve people. The other important reason for us to exist is we obviously fund the federal government and collect the money that it takes to fund the government. Now, my job as a leader, about 10 years ago, there was a restructuring of the IRS, and the decision was made it shouldn't be run by a tax professional, it should be run by someone who's run big institutions. And so I see my job as setting the strategic direction and driving to make sure that we get there. And while it's impossible to boil down all the leadership principles and the things you need to do to run any big agency, let me share with you at least 3 important ingredients that I came into the job with and that I found have been incredibly important. The first is you've got to get the organization behind you. One of my favorite quotes is Ken Chenault from American Express. I heard him speak once, and he said, there's only one key to leadership, and that's followership, getting people to follow you. And that's incredibly important to get the organization behind you and communicate why it's so important for people to deliver the things you're trying to deliver. As an example, we were asked to play a huge role in the economic recovery. Almost $300 billion of the Recovery Act ran through the tax system. We had to push a lot of money out the door quickly and help people get back on their feet. I spent a lot of time with our employees, saying, whether you're answering taxpayer questions on the phone, helping a small business understand the eligibility for a credit, building technology to process refunds very quick, you're helping the American people get back their financial footing and making sure people understand their connection with the mission. Second is you have to be very clear about what you're doing and communicate that to the whole organization. My personal belief is that there's tons of good plans out there sitting on shelves that never get executed, and the number one reason they don't get executed is because leaders fail to properly explain those plans, communicate it inside and outside the organization, and get people behind their game plan. And my third simple belief is that you need to be relentless and myopically focused on a handful of priorities. Again, any leader, whether they're at the top of the organization, in the middle of the organization, gets distracted with too many things, and understanding exactly where you're trying to go and stay focused on a handful of priorities, I think, is incredibly important. So with these principles in mind, I came into the institution 3 years ago, spent the first 90 days listening and learning and making sure I had the team in place that was going to execute the next 4 or 5 years at the IRS. And we came up with a handful of priorities. And what I want to talk to you today about is what were the priorities we laid out, where we are with those priorities, how far we've come, and then where we want to go. And then when we're done, we're obviously happy to answer any questions about those or anything else that we're working on. The first priority that we put in place is, and goal is to put a major dent in offshore tax evasion. In the U.S. and indeed in other wealthy nations, we view offshore tax evasion as an important thing when it comes to revenue, but also, and probably more importantly, an issue of fundamental fairness. The tax system in the U.S. is a voluntary compliance system. Most people come in, pay their taxes on time with no touch by the IRS from a compliance standpoint. Most firemen and school teachers and police officers have their taxes actually deducted from their paycheck. It's sent to the IRS by their employer, and they're 100% compliant and pay the taxes they owe. We view it that they need to believe that people who are wealthy enough to go play in the international capital markets can't go park their assets overseas, hide their money, and avoid paying taxes. It's an important thing. This has been an issue people have worked on for years. Every living IRS commissioner has called me and said, I did rounds with Switzerland and we never got any names. We came in and set this as a priority, had a strategic focus on it, and we've had a lot of victories along the way, and we're still pushing. We had a major agreement with the bank UBS to turn over, and we negotiated this with the Swiss government as well. They turned over 4,000 names to us of people hiding assets overseas. It's the first time that bank secrecy jurisdiction has ever turned over names. They didn't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They did it because we applied a lot of pressure and had good investigations going. We then took the momentum from that and the crack in bank secrecy and, frankly, the information we got from those accounts and other investigations going on. And we ran a voluntary disclosure program where we told people, come in, pay your back taxes, pay a stiff penalty, but you can avoid jail time because it's a criminal offense to have tax evasion, if there's a set of factors involved. When we sat around, we thought maybe 1,000 people would come in. In a typical year, we get about 100 people come in voluntarily and use our voluntary disclosure program. We now have over 19,000 people who have come in to that program. From the data we got from that program, we now have lots of other banks, lots of other bankers, lots of other leads into taxpayers. We're using the data we got to go and look at the next wave of investigations. If you think about our strategy around offshore tax evasion, though, we're going to bring billions of dollars into the coffers of the U.S. That's important. It's important in this time of deficits, and it's important in times of we're trying to have fiscal constraint. Much more important, though, is I think we've already changed the risk calculus for the next generation of taxpayers. And the notion that you would go park assets overseas and hide your money and not pay taxes is one that just people are much more cautious about. And frankly, if you're going to go commit a crime and try to get a little extra money illegally, I think people are thinking maybe there's better places to do it where I'm not going to get caught. And that was our goal. It's long-term deterrence. The next major priority we laid out is an initiative around tax return preparers. Today, 8 out of 10 people use either software or a tax return preparer. And so this is in response to a tectonic shift in the way the tax system works. 40 years ago, the image of paying your taxes was you sit down with a number 2 pencil, a calculator, you go through the 1040. It was a lot easier back then to go through and figure out the deductions and all the confusion of the tax code, and you sent in your taxes. The reality today is there's actually a whole set of intermediaries who sit between us and the taxpayer. And if we want to do our service job right and our compliance job right, we need to think about what are our interactions and requirements of those intermediaries, not just what's our interaction with the American people. I think of this as a point of leverage. Anytime you're running a big institution, you're looking for leverage points that can push you forward. And so we set off with this Return Prepare initiative. We recognized the change, and we recognized that one of the single biggest transactions that the average American has every year is paying their taxes. And so we basically are moving, we've now registered all 700,000 return preparers, so we have some way to track and know and connect preparers to returns. We're in the process of requiring people who aren't CPAs, lawyers, or enrolled agents to actually take a minimum competency test to make sure there's some minimum competency in the tax return professional community. Because right now, anybody can prepare a tax return. Sometimes you see out in the country, Bob's used car and tax return preparation. Bob might be great, but we want to make sure that he's providing good service. Because after all, if you don't provide good service to your customers in the tax context, you get your check, you go on with your business. The taxpayer's the one on the hook, not the preparer. If we come and audit you and you get a letter 2-3 years later, we resolve an issue, you owe back taxes and penalty. That does not help the American people. Going forward, we're going to refocus some of our compliance efforts on preparers. So we actually try to root out bad preparers will be a major priority, and make sure we provide good service and tools to preparers so the ones who are trying to get the job done get the job done well. My third priority that I and the team laid out is more and better use of data. There's general agreement around the globe in the tax world that when you have third-party reporting, compliance is much higher. I just told you about wage W-2 reporting and withholding. With teachers, they're 99% compliant. In general, if you're subject to information reporting, so 1099s, bank interest, 1098 mortgage interest, where you get the document and we get the document. So information reporting and withholding, 96% compliance. However, most estimates show that only around 50% of income is accurately reported when there's little or no information reporting. So information reporting is incredibly important to compliance. It's also incredibly important to service. For me, I know I'm much happier just getting a document from my employer that shows me exactly what I have to do on my tax return and go forward, rather than me rooting around my records, having to add up my paychecks or whatever else you would do if you didn't have third-party information reporting. Now, the IRS is an information-intensive organization, but it's the organization of the data that we have and ultimately the knowledge that we can extract from that data that really matters. And frankly, I think that will shift. I often say we're shifting from being much more about data analytics to go after the right risk profile and provide the right service to the right segments than we are about feet on the street. You know, the illusion of the IRS agents, there's very few people who actually go and talk to somebody in person at the IRS. Most people are analyzing data, working on computers, and if you interact with taxpayers, it's correspondence or on the phone. There's been some recent tax law changes and frankly some leapfrog changes over the last several years in information reporting. Starting next year, we're going to get merchant card data from the big payment processors, PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, will send us in aggregate how much money they've sent to a dry cleaner, gas station, anybody who accepts cards. We'll then use that data to compare it to tax returns and get a sense of accurate reporting. It could be a big boost in compliance. The other, if there's anyone here from Legg Mason, they know that, in the Legg Mason Tower, we're starting to get basis reporting. So right now, we just receive what the aggregate stock sale is, but we have no idea what the basis is, so we can't track the capital gains. We're actually going to start moving forward, getting basis reporting, mandatory reporting to us on a prospective basis. Again, it'll create so there's very little leakage in stock sales from a tax perspective. There's a set of other pieces of information reporting that is quite important and will enhance compliance. We worked very closely with Congress to get the law changed so that these would be requirements. I also created a Office of Compliance Analytics that's reporting directly to me, who's basically creating hypotheses about different treatment streams based on data that we have, working with our business units to run pilots of how to do a treatment. So for instance, you know, usually if you owe us taxes, you've agreed on taxes, you've gotten a set of due process notices, and you still owe us taxes, there'll be outreach at a certain point. One of the questions is, before we start sending notices, should we pick up the phone and just call you and have a conversation and see if we can't work out a payment plan? So that's a hypothesis people have. We didn't really have a systematic way to test hypothesis. We had our big systems. We either built into our systems or not. Now this group will create a hypothesis, test out with a group of taxpayers, see what the results are. If the results are what if the hypothesis proves out, we'll then institutionalize it and roll it into our systems. And it's a way of being better at data analytics, following the facts, and most importantly, continually evolving and improving as an institution. The real goal of data and analytics is to shift and use all of the power of computing, analytics, all of the things that have happened in the private sector about customer segmentation, and make sure we up our game. So again, we're servicing taxpayers well and spending our time with non-compliant taxpayers, not with a blanket approach. Let me now turn to technology. I will say technology technology is hard at any point. I used to oversee stock markets, and so I actually know about trying to manage technology in real time, trying to double computing power every 5 months and increasing speed. So it's hard to do technology. It's really, really, really hard to do technology in the federal government with annual budget cycles, very onerous procurement rules, which are there for a reason, to make sure that there's no fraud or abuse. But you can't, as the head of the organization, you don't just go in and quickly make deals to get people to bring their next generation of technology. It's quite extensive. And then there's tremendous oversight. Boards of directors struggle with how to oversee technology. Imagine what it's like to have multiple congressional committees, multiple inspector generals, multiple overseers trying to figure out, are you on the right course or not with technology. We actually set off and said, okay, since the 1980s, we've been trying to get our core database done. And there's been lots of starts and stops. And this is the database that says, how much do you owe? From what years do you owe? What is your actual name and address? It's your core account information. And I'm a big believer that the leader of an organization, if you have something big with technology, needs to be accountable and stay focused on technology. And so since 1980, we've been trying to get a core database that processed on a daily cycle rather than right now either a bi-weekly, every week or every 2 weeks. We run batch cycles. It delays refunds getting out to people under the current state. And it also means if you call in, you might have sent us a check, but it's not posted to the core account, and there can be confusion with the taxpayer. Long story short, we set out a plan. We went and sold the funding. We said we're going to drop a bunch of other technology projects, and we're really going to focus on getting this over the goal line. It's going to deliver the promise from the 80s, faster refunds, data at our fingertips for analytics to support the last strategy, and it's going to get rid of confusion with taxpayers, both in notices and phone calls. We're on track to deliver what we call CADE, our core account database, for next filing season. So all of you individual filers, when you go in, you're going to be processed through CADE. Everyone's going to get a faster refund. We're going to move forward. It does a couple things. One is I think it gets kind of a reputation off our back that we can't modernize. It does get us the tools that we need. And then it sets the future to really think about how the tax system should work. One thing that I'm very interested in is the fact that our whole tax system is a retrospective look back. So you send us your return, we process it, send you a refund. We do most of our data matching after we've done that. And if we think we've made if we have a problem, we then go out with an audit or a notice and get money back. We've laid out a vision that we're now kind of boiling down into something that's closer to a plan that says, what if we could get all that third-party data, 1099s, W-2s, 1098s, loaded in our systems before you filed? When you file, if you've got a mismatch, rather than potentially getting a letter from us 2 years from now and going through, redigging up your records and going and finding your advisor, it kicks it back and says, we see a mismatch, let's file it correctly. Increases compliance, increases service. We even think we could potentially make this database available to taxpayers. So when you're sitting down, instead of rooting around in whatever file you put the thing that says important tax return information, you just push a button, it's right there and you can get it from the IRS. But again, getting our core technology done is a prerequisite for the future, and we're on our path to deliver this relational database this year. Now, if you look at my set of strategic priorities, they all have a service element. And I told you it's incredibly important that we serve the vast majority of Americans well. Service means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And we've had a whole agenda just around the theme of service issue resolution with taxpayers. During the economic downturn, we changed our procedures so people could have a missed payment. If they lost a job and were underwater on their house, we would try not to get in the way if they were trying to refinance their house. Things that are common sense that help taxpayers keep their footing, stay on track, pay taxes for the long term. And so we try to be very flexible. We had thousands of Saturday open houses to help people resolve issues. Just this February, we launched something called Fresh Start, which is helping taxpayers, giving them lots of other venues to pay back taxes, easier to get an installment agreement with us, easier to get a compromise if you really can't pay, and ways to avoid a tax lien. We also set out to try to make just our communications easier. If any of you ever gotten an IRS notice, until recently, or 10 years ago, it was dot matrix, printed out a lot of legalese. Now it's not dot matrix anymore. We have laser printers. But a lot of the notices, it was hard to figure out what it was we were trying to do. So we have a major notice clarity project, just trying to make something you get from us as easy as a credit card bill. And so you can look at it, you know what you need to do, you know who you need to call. Just last month, we actually won the Clearmark Grand Prize Award from the Center for Plain Language, which honored us for now, just for us, a lot of our core notices just becoming much simpler, much more plain language. Just small steps forward, but they're ones that we think are important to the whole mix. E-filing, one of the huge success stories in government. The White House actually just said, they want to make the government and technology create better service and less costs. If you e-file your tax return, it costs 17 cents for us to process it. If you send us a piece of paper, it costs us $3.66. In the last 10 years, through us building the right applications and promoting and marketing it correctly, we've gone from 30% of people e-filing to 70% of people e-filing. And it's going to be higher than that this year. We don't have the final tally. You knock that against 140 million people. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of savings for the federal government. And you'll see us just continually to innovate. This year, again, the common thing of IRS, big, monolithic bureaucracy. We have an iPhone app, IRS to go, where you can track your refund on your iPhone, because we recognize the next generation of folks, aren't even necessarily going to our website. And so we're going to keep innovating as an institution. I think it's important. The other big innovation in service is we're fundamentally trying to reshape the relationship with corporate taxpayers. For too long, we were in kind of trench warfare, where we set up a position, they set up a position, they went to our appeals, they went to court, and it was an adversarial system, and we didn't have a lot of venues to resolve issues. I would posit it was a waste of our time. It was a waste of corporations' time. And what we need to do is find the right issues, have a real honest discussion with corporations about those issues, and if people want to resolve and get on the side and see if you can come to a resolution, we should have ways to do resolution. So we've got a whole suite of programs, from embedding appeals officers in an exam who you can work out an appeal right away. We're creating these industry issue resolutions, complex issues like amortization of telecom assets that we would fight for years with corporations. We just created some safe harbors, and we're looking to get more safe harbors and guidance out that gets to about the right place, rather than spending lots of resources trying to get to the actual, very detailed place in a sometimes ambiguous tax code. And we have this program called CAP, where corporations come in, work with us the year before they file returns. We see their information in real time, any issues we work out, and by the time you file your tax return, there's no risk of an audit. You've actually agreed with the IRS on everything in your tax return. We've gone from about 30 major corporations, Fortune 500 corporations, in that program a couple years ago to 150. My view is this is the future. You want to get things resolved in real time. You want to resolve issues. If you've got to disagree and go to court, so be it. We're still going to have that situation, but we should create every venue we can to resolve issues up front. It's the way that I think government and the private sector should work together. So those are some of our leading edge initiatives in corporation, and that's kind of a long explanation of the fourth priority around service, transforming the relationship with individual and corporate taxpayers, and being a place where you can get issues resolved. Now, I've described a whole bunch of other things, but at the end of the day, I believe you can't deliver at a 100,000 person organization unless one of your core priorities is your people. And so during my 90 days of listening at the very beginning of my term, I actually set up what I call the Workforce of Tomorrow Task Force. It was the first thing I did. I got a senior executive reporting directly into me. We put together kind of a broad cross-section of people at the IRS, and we said, what do we need to do for over the next 5 years to make the IRS the best place to work in government? Most studies you ever see say, if you have engaged employees, show up every day, feel like their judgment is being used, feel like you're taking care of poor performers and giving career paths for the good performers, then you deliver on mission and you serve your customers. And so we had the Workforce Tomorrow Task Force. We had issues around culture. We did some simple things like making sure people who spent all their time in the field had a cell phone, a BlackBerry, and a wireless card so they could actually get their job done and not spend 2 hours a day driving back and forth to IRS offices, so just basic productivity tools. I'm incredibly heartened to see that what we started 3 years ago has penetrated our 100,000 person organization. From 2008 to 2010, we jumped from 8th place to 3rd place among agencies in the best place to work in government survey, which is a survey of all federal government agencies. And the 8th to 3rd was large agencies that have over 100,000 people, because that's a very different kind of workforce than a 2,000 person research institution workforce. The jump was due to higher scores in the 3 of the core areas we had really put a lot of focus on, and those were job satisfaction, satisfaction with the overall organization, and what I call the money question, which is how willing would you be to recommend the organization as a good place to work to a friend or family member. You always say if you tell someone in your quiet conversation you should come work here, it's a great place to work, you're doing well. If the survey says one thing and when you're grumbling about your job and you tell people it's a horrible place to work, you're not going to do great as an organization. So we've made good progress there. I think we still have a lot of work ahead, as any organization does. You can't take your eye off the ball, but our people was another strategic priority. So I said at the beginning that we set out and had 6 strategic priorities. I've tried to keep myself and our senior team myopically focused on that, and there's lots of incoming that we could dally with and dance with. But I will also say it's hard to keep a proactive agenda, and there's certain times, like when a law is passed, in our case, where you've got to deal with what I call incoming priorities. And we actually, during this economic downturn, have had a couple of big incoming priorities, which is really must-do work for the country. And so we had to take that in. And we created a little bandwidth, knowing that at the IRS you can't just lay it out and stay focused and have Congress and the president have no say in exactly what you work on. The 2 big things that came into us were the Recovery Act. I mentioned $288 billion of the Recovery Act, of the $800 billion Recovery Act, ran through the tax system. Everything from the Making Work Pay credit that we had to reprogram our systems, train our people, communicate with taxpayers, which got 95% of Americans a tax break, to things like net operating loss carrybacks, where you can carry back a loss this year. If you have a loss this year, you can recoup some of the taxes you paid in previous years. Usually you can only carry it back 2 years. The Recovery Act expanded it to 5 years. Overall, we got a lot bigger number than $33 billion out through the Recovery Act, just through that extension. But during that time, which I know everybody remembers, when the credit markets were frozen, and literally people could not get lines of business, banks were just shutting down revolvers, we put $33 billion out to businesses, most of them small businesses. We became, in some ways, the lender of last resort. And so focusing on things like that when the President and the Congress call on you to try to do something to really help the country are important for us. I would also mention the Affordable Care Act, the Health Reform Act. Most of the money flows are running through the tax system, so we've also been asked to take a laboring oar in that proposition, again, to be like the bank, to give people refundable credits, to collect the money to pay for it. So those are what I call incoming priorities, and most businesses are going to have some incoming priorities based on the change in market, competitors, et cetera. We obviously have those in a government agency. I think the lessons learned here are that we can't be rigid, we can't be calcified, we have to be agile and nimble enough to not lose focus on our priorities, but also respond to the realities of the economy and the marketplace. So let me conclude. 3 years ago, we set out with a focus on 6 strategic priorities: offshore tax evasion, data capture and analytics, tax return preparers, taxpayer service and issue resolution, our technology, and our people. The economic downturn and some new policy directions added 2 other major initiatives to our agenda. But by staying focused, we've made significant headway in all of these areas, and I would posit have made lasting positive changes to the nation's tax system, which should position it well to serve the American people in the future. Now, I called this speech not knowing exactly what I was going to say, but 2 months ago they said, "What are you going to call your speech so we can print a program?" But I thought, I had an inkling of what I wanted to talk about. I called it leading around corners because I view my job as head of a 100,000 person organization is not just meeting today's challenges, but positioning this institution for the next 10 or 20 years, for being ready for what lies around the corner, and for making sure the public servants of the organization know where we're headed. So I look around me today, thought about speaking to a business school audience, and I know that there's lots of people ready to take the next mantle in leadership, whether it be in business or education, or I hope some people think about public service, and I wish everybody the best as they move forward. Let me end by and leave you with the words of John Quincy Adams, which I think still ring true today. If your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, and do more, you're a leader. So thanks for listening to me today, and happy to answer some questions.
I didn't think there would be anything interesting about the IRS, so I was wrong. I have 2 questions. One is, if you've got all these great data analytics, which I think is really impressive, why don't you just send us a tax bill with our 1040 all filled out, and then we can correct it? That's one idea. And then, like the property tax people do. And then the other question I have is, in these conversations you've had with corporations and businesses, what do they think, or what do they tell you is a fair tax burden for them?
So on the first one, there's been this idea kicking around of we send you a bill. I would say, one is we've vastly underfunded IRS technology for 20, 25 years. Where I came from in the stock market business, and we ran compliance analytics, looking at stock trades, we spent 20, 25% of our budget on capital investments in technology. The benchmark amount that financial service institutions spend, of all kinds, which do similar things to us, take in all this data, process the data, interact with customers, have a web presence, have databases that hold information. They spend 12%, 15% of their budget on capital investments in technology. When I came in for the last 20 years, we'd been spending 1 to 1.5%. When I went to try to get it up to 3%, you could imagine the grilling I went through. "Oh my God, Commissioner, you're doubling your technology investment." And I said, this is kind of a pathetic conversation. I'm going from 1.5% to 3%. We should be at 12 or 15%. So it's a long way of saying we're just getting this core database done so we can have the core information. Right now, we don't have all the 1099s, 1098s, the W-2s loaded in time that we could process it and send you a tax bill. And then there's a real debate. There's a lot of people who have wondered. People say, I should send you a tax bill. And there's a real debate, and people say, well, I don't want the IRS sending me a tax bill. It's a voluntary system. I get to report what I say it is, not just get a tax bill. And so we're not at the point where we could legitimately say we could do it if you want it to, and then we would have the debate with Congress about whether to do it. And so I think it'll be a debate in the years to come, but it's probably 5 or 10 years off to even us credibly say, yeah, we could maybe do that. I'm not sure I understood your question about, did you say about corporations, what do they say about what's the fair amount of taxes to pay? You know, there's no, I don't think there's any consensus. I mean, my impression, I sat on corporate boards, is taxes is a, you know, it's a basically expense to be managed, as well as, you know, I would hope a lot of people feel it's something that they get a lot of benefits from this great country, so that there's, you know, some amount that every individual, corporation, everyone else should pay in to make sure we have a military for defense, to make sure we have highways and everything else. You know, I think it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I don't think there's a consensus on taxes. What I will, and exactly how much a corporation should pay versus individuals, what I will say is, you know, the president has embarked on a path, and Treasury Secretary Geithner, of understanding that our corporate tax code is one that's grown up over time with a lot of additions, some of them more sensible than others, some of them based on interest groups. There's a real focus on making sure that however it's structured in a way that keeps our companies competitive. And so there's actually, you know, a plan being worked on and being discussed with Congress to potentially have some changes to the corporate tax code, but that's ongoing.
I just wondered, have you looked at how other countries do their taxes and have their tax arrangements, and do you have relationships with a lot of other countries to try and focus on some of the tax evasion issues which you have said were a priority?
I am chairman of something called the Forum on Tax Administration, which is my counterparts around the globe, and so I have the occasion to spend a fair amount of time with the 40 leaders in the tax world from different countries and compare systems. A lot of it is, the U.S. tax code is incredibly complicated. One of my favorite statistics is that it's 4 times longer than War and Peace. And so I think a lot of the systems and the process flow from how we've structured our taxes. And we take a big share from individuals. Some countries take a much bigger share from corporations, and they've got a VAT, which originally flows down, eventually flows down. A VAT's, it's not quite a sales tax, but you take some tax out along the value chain of any commercial process, and it happens at the retail and wholesale level. That's just a different way of getting at, what it means is products are more expensive, and but you get income tax through that. And so there's vast, differences based on the tax structure. I've tried to focus our group on places where we can really work together. And so the 2 huge focuses we've had since I've been chair of this organization, one has been about a lot more intense sharing of information about tax evasion. Because sometimes it's a zero-sum game. A big corporation pays tax, gets a credit, and we have this competent authority negotiation process where we figure out, which country gets the taxes. And so our interests aren't always aligned. I mean, we're trying to just get the right amount. But when it comes to, crooks hiding money overseas, they're gaming both systems, and everybody wants to share. And so there's a lot more informal and formal sharing of information. We've actually set up something called the Joint Information Tax Shelter Center here in Washington and London, where we've co-located with a bunch of other countries, people who can do real-time investigations together on people using really egregious techniques for evasion. And then we also set a framework, which is quite interesting, for joint audits. This is as much a service and kind of smoothing the wheels as it is a compliance measure. But it struck me when I was in capital markets regulation, I was always struck by a big bank would get a customer trade, and they'd say they want to buy 1 million shares of IBM. And they'd start in New York at 3 in the afternoon. They'd get as many as they could. And that order would then go to their London desk, or I go to their Tokyo desk. They get as much as they could, and it would end up in London. And it was same customer, same economic transaction, 3 different regulatory regimes. And so I was always struck, before I came into this job, that the future has to be, governments are pretty good, and regulators or government entities, they're quite good at talking amongst themselves and sharing best practices. Less good, and still recently, actually, the financial crisis pushed us along in this direction, at real coordinated action. And so we use this OECD, Forum on Tax Administration, to set a framework for doing a joint audit of a corporation where they could come in, give one presentation, get their issues resolved with both countries at the same time, rather than do one country's audit, another country's audit. If the countries disagreed, have 5 or 6 years of negotiation about where it goes. And we've actually launched 3 of these now. And so, my whole theory is you create frameworks, but they mean nothing. You're going to learn, they mean something, but you're going to learn a heck of a lot more by actually practical work on the ground. And so now we're trying this, and we're just trying to be a model. I mean, while I'm here, the next however long I'm here, and the next 4 or 5 years, we're not going to revolutionize the cooperation and real coordinated action amongst governments, but you got to start somewhere and start pushing things forward.
Commissioner, 2 questions. The first question is, I'd like to get your views on our Congress and their tax legislation. If I remember correctly, I think last calendar year there were 30 pieces of legislation that had a tax impact. And yet it wasn't until December that we knew what tax rates were going to be going forward. In my mind, it's irresponsible legislation. They're making it difficult for tax preparers, difficult for taxpayers. I can't imagine the issues of trying to come out with forms when you don't know what the laws are. So I'd like to get your input on whether or not we have any hope for responsible tax legislation going forward. And the second question is, I'd like to get your views on the use of Schedule UTP going forward.
Sure.
That has a lot of businesses very concerned.
Obviously, it's not easy to run a big financial institution when the rules of the game are put in place 3 days before you're supposed to actually start. Because you got to program computers, you want to have proper testing and risk mitigation, you want to train your people, you want to get forms, et cetera. And I think it's unfortunate that the norm has become late legislation. I took the unusual act of writing to the leaders of the Ways and Means and Finance Committee back in October and then again in November, just unsolicited, and just said, you guys do what you need to do from a political standpoint, but here's how much time we're going to need. Here's how it's going to affect taxpayers. And so my view is where the rubber hits the road with taxpayers and see the practical effects on taxpayers. My responsibility is just to tell people what we can and can't do with the circumstances that are put in place. And so we actually delayed. Anybody who itemized their return couldn't file this year until February 14th. Usually we open up about a month earlier. Luckily, everybody caught up, but there's some people who didn't get their refunds as quick as they would have liked. Put a lot of stress in our system. If we have tons of changes next year, we're trying to deliver the CADE database. We want to keep our technology people focused on that, not diverting over to make systems changes. So I think it makes it I think the temporary nature of our tax code and the constant changes make it really difficult for the American people. And I don't bemoan what it is to us. I mean, we're trying to serve the American people, and we'll deal with it. And unfortunately, we've gotten kind of used to it and pretty good at it. But I think it's not a great situation. You asked if if I had hope. I'm a very optimistic guy. I love democracy. I think Congress has ups and downs, and the political system has ups and downs. We've been at a place where there's been, we counted, almost 3,000 changes to the tax law since 2010, or since 2000 in the last 10 years. It's almost a change a day. And so the tax code, there's broad consensus that the tax code is way too complicated, that it needs to be simplified, but it's hard, because it's real money, because you change it and you can do a net neutral change, but that doesn't mean some people aren't going to pay more and some people pay less. So it's hard, but the history of the country is we write ourselves over time. I'm a big believer the American people will vote where they need to get to make the whole thing work. So I'm an optimist. Schedule UTP, for people who don't know what that is, we put in place starting this year a requirement that taxpayers give us a list of their uncertain tax positions. Several years ago, FIN 48, an accounting provision, required that taxpayers put on their financial statements a tax reserve for things that they've interpreted as they might have to make an adjustment were the IRS to challenge them on a certain set of taxes. We put a requirement out that said, we don't want to see your risk calculation and how you calculated the reserve, but we'd like to see that list so we can spend our time talking about the right issues and other reasons. The premise behind it was I'd go out and talk with our big case auditors, and we're starting with companies that have $100 million in assets or more. I'd go out and talk to our auditors on big cases. They'd spend about 25% of their time just trying to find issues and trying to understand the taxpayer's situation. And frankly, we'd be rooting around and probably not being as effective in putting burden on corporations trying to find these issues. I'm a believer that at the end of the day, we want the same thing a taxpayer wants, which is we want certainty sooner so we can all use our resources effectively. We want consistency amongst taxpayers. And we want to spend our time with corporations and individuals that pose the greatest risk to noncompliance and not spend our time with people who don't pose a great risk to noncompliance. So I think the UTP supports all those goals. And if you put it in the context of our CAP program, trying to get better guidance out and putting the proper safe harbors in place, having fast track appeals where we can get your appeal done a lot earlier right in the middle of an audit, the whole package basically says, you be more transparent with us, we'll commit to making sure our audit approach is correct and we don't overreach, and we'll resolve issues sooner, which will be good for the economy, good for taxpayers, good for tax administration. Now, corporations are very worried about sending us a list of the places where we might challenge them. I've been very clear that we're going to have a centralized unit that's going to look at that list. That list is going to be called for places where there's common themes, where it might not be that the corporation is pushing the envelope. It might be that the tax law is unclear and we need to ask Congress to change it, or our guidance from the law is unclear. And so we're going to have major guidance projects coming out of the first list of UTPs. We've also been clear and are retraining our agents to say, what they're really afraid of is we're going to get the list and agents are going to go and set up adjustments on all of the pieces on the list. We've been clear with our agents that just because it's on the list doesn't mean A, you set up an adjustment, or B, that it even needs to necessarily be looked at. Part of this is, corporations will see it when they see it, whether we're fair or not with this. We're very committed to this. Our head of Large Business International, Heather Malloy, and her team are traveling the country, spending a lot of time retooling this relationship with taxpayers. But we're very committed. I'm a big believer that the system is set up based on transparency and that this is a totally appropriate thing to do and it's going to save us time and it's going to be good for corporations. But I understand corporations are nervous and we're just, with anything new, we're going to have to work through it in a way that's responsible and have lots of open dialogue about it as we move forward.
UBS and Credit Suisse have a large presence in the United States, and I imagine that provided some leverage in trying to get them to disclose bank account names. How does the strategy change, and what has the success been with smaller offshore bank accounts that don't necessarily have, or banks that don't necessarily have a presence in the United States but still have clients?
Obviously not talking about any specific investigation. We've got lots of different pieces of our international offshore strategy. People do business in the U.S. There's a whole set of courts, et cetera. And let me be clear. I've always been very clear. My interest is U.S. taxpayers paying their taxes. It's not about other governments, and institutions that are facilitating it is obviously something that we'll pay attention to. But at the end of the day, my job is about the U.S. Taxpayer. Our strategy, we've got leverage points. If they're U.S. investors, they're in the U.S., and so we have the U.S. courts, and we've got all the tools that we have at our disposal. Other governments want to do business with the U.S., don't want to be seen as non-cooperative, so we've got treaties and exchange of information agreement where we can get information from banks. And recently there's been a law passed that in the future, for people to do business in the U.S. And have access to capital markets or U.S. company stock, they're going to need to do certain sets of reporting. And so, definitely people with big presence in the U.S., we have more jurisdiction. One of the reasons we focus so much on international is the world's global now. Governments haven't all figured out how do you take your sovereign authority, respect the sovereign authority of other nations, but still comply with your set of laws. And these are all things that are going to be sorted out during the next 30, 40, 50 years, and we're doing our part. And so, lots of different ways to do it.